Hi guys. How many of you are familiar with what's happening in Hong Kong right now? Guys, have a show of hands. Okay, so the Hong Kong protests were started off as a movement against the extradition bill that China was trying to impose upon Hong Kong, but it since grew into a movement that's now about the democracy of Hong Kong. It's calling for the resignation of their leader Carrie Lam, and among other things. So just imagine that it's a picture of people wearing yellow vests. So are you guys familiar with what's happening in France? Like very recently, there's a video that's of them shouting for revolution and all that. So it started off almost a year ago, and now it's since grown into a movement where it's calling for the resignation of their president, calling for changes in economic reforms, etc., etc. How about in Chile? So the Chile protest started off as a protest against the train fare hikes. So there was an increase in train fares. But then it since grew into a movement that's now calling for the resignation of their president, an end to neoliberalism. So many of these, from a very small issue that they had, it since grew into something much larger, much more, as you can see here, much more pressing issues they started to tackle. How about the climate movements around the world? So I'm pretty sure you guys are very familiar with people like Greta Thunberg and all that. So the climate movements is really impressive because as shown last year, with just Greta Thunberg being alone in front of her in the Swedish parliament, now it's since grown to a movement of like millions of people all around the world who are clamoring for climate action. So as you can see, we're at a very interesting point in time of our history, where there seems to be a lot of these a lot of people are starting to act upon these things. A lot of people are deciding to get together, go out on the streets, clamor for change, and it really makes you want to ask the question, is it time for change? Is it time for change in our society, in our country, and in the world? And this change can come in a lot of forms. And I guess one of the forms that's usually bandied about is a revolution of sorts. And I was invited here to talk about social activism and the formation of revolution. So the next question, while it's a bit loaded, let's see if we can. Let's have a show of hands. Who do you think? Do you guys think it's time for a revolution here in the Philippines? Okay, there are a few hands. Hold up, we can't ask this question like that and just get away with it. We have to ask the very essential question: what is a revolution even? Because it's a word that's being very liberally used. It's a word that's being bandied about. Oh, this is a revolutionary piece of technology, or this will revolutionize how people behave or how people think. So it's a word that really needs to be dissected. It's a word that really needs to be understood before we can start asking whether or not we should have a revolution here in our country. So according to the the most trusted internet resource, Wikipedia, a revolution is a fundamental and relatively sudden change in political power and organization. Is that it? Because for me personally, I don't think that encapsulates a lot of the concrete aspects of what a revolution really is. I mean, okay, we can say that, this sort of movement does fit that bill or whatever, but it's really how we concretize these terms like that so that we understand what exactly a revolution stands for. So how about we retrace our roots? Let's go to something closer to home. Was this a revolution? Of course it was. The 1896 Philippine Revolution was something that we're all very familiar with. But it does beg the question whether or not the methods that they used in the 1896 Philippine Revolution are actually still applicable now. I mean, do you expect everybody to start tearing up cedulas or start waving around yung mga itak and mga machete? Is that something that we're still expecting in this day and age in the 21st century? Of course not. So we really have to ask the question, what is a revolution in the context of the 21st century? Oh, okay, are these revolutions, were the examples that I mentioned earlier, revolutions? We have yet to see because we're not sure if they fit the bill with regards to the Wikipedia definition, whether they're comparable to what happened in 1896 or any of the other revolutions that occurred during the span of the history of the world. So we really have to wait and see as to whether or not these count as revolutions. And I guess a more important question that we have to ask is not only if it's time for a revolution or what is a revolution, is how do you even start a revolution? Is it something that you can just start overnight or like get a group of people, get a bunch of people together and actually just clamor for things? Is that a revolution already? And I guess the answer to this, while it's very cheesy and very simple, is actually my answer to this is actually what I guess is the most honest answer that I can give you right now. And that fact is, you start a revolution by starting from the beginning. You start from scratch. You start from nothing. Because all of these things we really have to work together, we really have to add up all these things. So we ensure that if we really want to strive for social change in our society, we have to start from nothing, really, essentially. So what I'll be talking about right now is my personal experience with my organization, particularly Agham Youth. Because in Agham Youth, we clamor for things such as science and technology for the people, the better treatment of scientists here in our country, as well as something called free education. So I'm pretty sure you guys are free education because you guys are precise scholars, right? But the free education that I'll be talking about specifically is the free education in terms of the state universities and colleges such as UP Diliman and other state universities and colleges around the Philippines. So it started around 2016, 2017. There was already a few seeds of the clamor for free education back then. But the problem was it didn't have a lot of basis as it did right now. So what exactly Agham Youth did as an organization, it strived to actually look behind the science of it all. Look at the data, look at the facts and figures. Because there's a number being floated around at that point, around 8 billion pesos, and people were starting to ask whether or not that budget or that amount was actually feasible for free education. So what Agham Youth did was exactly that. It started to crunch the data, it started to crunch the numbers, and actually asked the question whether or not free education was actually feasible. And true enough, it concluded after getting all the government data that was available, after comparing the budgets that were allotted for free education, they actually concluded that indeed it was feasible with the budget that was being provided. But of course, a study like that, but just sitting on the shelf won't do anything good for anyone. So what really needs to be done is, of course, you have to spread awareness. You have to really talk to people about it and really get it out there that, okay, free education is feasible. And once people start realizing that something is feasible and there's actually basis to the clamor that people are asking for, clamoring for free education, for example, they'll really start to realize that, okay, maybe there is some sense to what these people are talking about. There's really some sense into what we're doing as a movement. And from there, of course, the study that was conducted and ultimately ended up inspiring a lot of the movements or the mobilizations that came afterwards. And these mobilizations did not just come in the form of the rallies that, of course, a lot of people are usually relate to activism. It also came in the form of dialogues with congressmen, congresswomen. It also came in the form of lobbying to government officials. And also, of course, and the mobilizations that we're very familiar with. So as you can see here, a lot of people really clamored loudly for the free education movement. And ultimately, we got what we wanted. And there. So within a span of a few years, the president was able to sign the free tuition bill into law, and then that ultimately led to the free education that's being currently experienced by the state universities and colleges around the Philippines. So going back to the question, as I mentioned earlier, how do you start a revolution? I guess from my experience, we can start condensing it into a few key components, really, when it comes to starting your own revolution. So when you go out of this auditorium, you can already start your own revolution wherever you go. So the first step is really to raise awareness. So as Agham Youth did during its early stages of the free education campaign, it really started by building the science behind the movement. So just as you can see what's happening with the climate movement, that a lot of people are rallying behind the science of it all, behind the scientists that are saying, oh, we only have a few years before the world ends or whatever. So by rallying behind the science and raising awareness and getting the facts out there, that's how we start building a movement as big as the free education movement was back in a few years ago. The next one is to get organized and to organize. So what does this mean? Of course, it's really, there's a lot of people saying that, of course, it's really when you start getting organized or start moving as a collective unit, that's how we start enacting change in our society. Because, of course, being an individual or doing your individual efforts do contribute, but it's really through having a collective voice in terms of organization or having an organization that we really start seeing change enacted in society. And that's how we see the movements such as the climate movement, such as the movements in Chile, in Hong Kong, that growing into such large numbers because these people are organized in a manner that they really see what's happening around, what's happening in their countries and deciding to act upon it. And the last step is, of course, to get moving. Because, of course, you can be as aware as you want, you can be as organized as you want, but if you don't do anything about it, you're still not changing society. So of course, the next step is to mobilize, to participate in rallies, to go out and talk to congressmen, congresswomen, to lobby in front of government. And that's really how we start seeing change enact in society. And I guess the next question to ask after how do you start a revolution and what a revolution is even, is that who can start a revolution even to begin with? And that's really the question that a lot of people have in their minds, and they're really trying to see themselves in the context of actually starting a revolution or clamoring for social change. And I guess the Philippine Science High School actually has a very strong heritage when it comes to starting revolutions, because when you look at our history, it's not really clear in the picture right there, but as you can see, it says Philippine Science High Supreme Student Council. And that just shows that the students back in their time during the Marcos era really saw their place in the world, really saw their position in and their place in society really, to start clamoring for actual change in society. And we have a number of martyrs from the Philippine Science High School, and it really goes to show how much dedicated the students were, despite just being students. They were still very active when it came to social issues, to national issues. And of course, the youth, the studentry, really contributed greatly to what ended up being the revolution of 1986, where Marcos was overthrown, and ultimately the dictatorship was ended. So as you can see, the movements of the youth is really reliable, or really something that we can count upon when it comes to actually enacting social change, because it's the youth that really have a lot to gain from being active in these issues, because it's our future that we're fighting for. And I don't think that the practices of the past, the mobilizations and everything, are a thing of the past, because up until now we still have these really large movements that really contribute greatly to society and really try to push for change, social change and national change in our own country. And going back to the question, who can start a revolution, I firmly believe that it's something that we all can do. We as a collective, we as a group have that capacity to enact for change, to clamor for change right now here in the 21st century. Thank you very much.